"You do not deserve to stand by Mom," my sister hissed, and the word coward hit harder than the marching band behind us. Her fingers dug into my arm as she smiled for the neighbors filing into Jacksonville Town Hall in North Carolina for the Veterans Day tribute. From the outside, we looked like a proud family, 2 daughters bringing their mother to be honored on stage. Inside, it felt like every old bruise waking up at once. "Do not parade yourself like some hero, Mara," she breathed, just loud enough for the women behind us to hear. "You ran. You are a coward. You left us in that house." I felt their eyes on my back, and I knew exactly what they thought. People here like stories that fit in one sentence, and Ashley has been feeding them the same one for years. She stayed. I ran. She is the good daughter. I am the one who abandoned everyone. None of them knows that this morning I drove in from Camp Lejeune with a duffel bag of uniforms locked in my trunk. None of them knows that I have stood in real fire and called for air support on nights when the radio cracked and the air tasted like dust and metal. None of them knows that when some Marines whisper the word Valkyrie, they are talking about me. To this room, I am just the younger Keaton girl who left home at 18 and never really came back. My name is Captain Mara Keaton, United States Marine Corps. I am 28 years old, and on paper, I am home on a short block of leave. In truth, I am here because my commanding officer told me that if my mother is getting a Veterans Day commendation, I should stand in the same room as the woman who taught me what service looks like. Before she tried to hold a broken house together, my mother was a Navy medic. There's a photo in my wallet of her in scrubs, smiling next to a Marine she has just patched up. The Marines in my unit know that picture. They know the simple version of my toxic family story, the short lines about a dad who yelled, and a sister who learned to rewrite every scene in his favor. They have heard me turn family betrayal into something almost funny over cold coffee. What they do not know is how that one word still slides under my armor. Coward. Ashley pulled me toward the edge of the crowded hallway past a table of folded flags and framed photos of local veterans. Her nails bit deeper into my skin each time she waved with her free hand. "Morning, Pastor Hill," she chirped, then turned without dropping the smile. "Remember your place, Mara. This day is about Mom, not about whatever revenge stories you collected in your desert playground." For a second, I was 16 again, in this same building, a police officer asking if we were safe, while my sister said we are fine. She exaggerates. Some of us stayed and dealt with real life, Ashley announced, suddenly loud enough for people near the doors to hear. Mara left when Dad started getting really bad. It was too much for her. A couple of heads turned. One of my aunts gave me a soft, pitying smile that cut worse than any glare. "Not everyone is cut out for hard things, sweetheart," she said as she passed. I swallowed the answer that rose in my throat, the one about convoys and ambushes, and the night a call I made sent 8 Marines home instead of to a flag-covered box. In this room, none of that matters. Here I am, the daughter who left her mother in a bad marriage and joined the military because she wanted adventure. I am the one who calls twice a year, sends money when asked, and stays away because she cannot face what she walked out of. They do not know about the ribbon in the drawer I rarely open or the citation that mentioned how my team spotted a pattern nobody else caught. My sister has never asked. It is easier if leaving always means cowardice, and staying always means courage. The sound in the lobby shifted like a current, The marching band outside fell quiet. The chatter dipped, and the heavy glass doors at the front of the hall opened. Cold November air rolled in with the sharp lines of Marine dress blues. I saw them over my sister's shoulder first, a small formation with caps tucked under their arms and medals catching the overhead lights. Leading them was Gunnery Sergeant Miguel Ortiz, a man I had last seen under a foreign sky, his arm in a sling, laughing, because we were both still alive. He stepped through the doorway and began to scan the crowd the way Marines do, counting exits and faces. Then his eyes found mine. For a heartbeat, he froze. The easy social smile slid off his face and his shoulders straightened. Not relaxed veteran at a small town event. Marine acknowledging his officer. "Captain Keaton," he said, his voice cutting through the murmur in the hall. "Valkyrie." "Mom, I did not know you would be here." Heads turned. People saw a Marine in full dress standing straighter than anyone else in the room, speaking to the woman they had just heard called a coward. Ashley's hand tightened around my arm so hard my fingers tingled. The word captain hung between us, strange and heavy, in the place where I had only ever been girl or daughter or disappointment. Behind Ortiz, a lieutenant colonel from base followed his line of sight. Recognition lit his face. "That is Valkyrie," he murmured. On the small stage, the master of ceremonies tapped the microphone and called everyone to their seats, promising that in a few minutes we would honor Corpsman Linda Keaton for her years of service. The crowd began to move toward the rows of folding chairs. Ortiz stepped back to fall in with the others still watching me for a signal. I gave him a small nod. We would talk later, away from all these curious eyes trying to fit coward and captain into the same sentence. As I took my place near the back like my sister wanted, the shame in my chest did not vanish, but it shifted. The old hurt was still there, but now it sat beside something colder. I thought of every time my mother pressed ice to a bruise and told me not to make trouble. I thought of every quiet revenge I have seen in my line of work every moment when someone finally stood up and rewrote the story pinned on them. I sat down, the word coward still echoing in my ears, the word captain ringing louder now, and I knew this morning was not just about my mother getting a plaque. It was the day my town would start to find out who I really was and what I had done with the life I once ran for. I remember the years between 2007 and 2013, not as a straight line of childhood, but as a slow tightening of air inside the Keaton house, a place where the walls carried the smell of spilled beer and the echo of slammed doors, and where every night felt like waiting for something to break, and most of the time it did, because my father, Tom, came home with the same bitter look, whether he had worked a long shift or spent the evening drinking with men who fed his anger. And once he crossed the threshold, he moved through the house like a storm, knocking over whatever sat in his way, muttering that nobody respected him and nobody understood the pressures he carried, and then somehow it always became my mother's fault, even though she was the only one who could patch his cuts and stop his bleeding and keep the house from turning into pure chaos. My mother, Linda, had been a Navy corpsman long before I was born. She had held the hands of Marines twice her size while they fought to stay awake after injury. Yet she stood in our kitchen, taking the weight of a man who never once asked how it felt for her to trade war trauma for domestic violence. She survived a battlefield only to step into another one that nobody outside our home could see. And because she had grown up in a generation told to keep family matters private, she endured more than she should have, quietly, steadily hoping it would not spill onto us. Ashley watched all of it with a sharper eye than anyone my older sister, who learned early how to position herself closest to our father. Good side, the one who could make him laugh when he was on the edge of shouting, and who figured out how to tell stories that painted her as the loyal daughter and me as the problem child, and she became the golden child, the one teachers praised, the one neighbors trusted, the one who could tilt a whole narrative with a single sentence, said sweetly enough to seem harmless. I was the one who kept asking dangerous questions, and I did not even understand they were dangerous until the first time Tom swung a bottle at the wall and shards scattered across the floor. My mother crouched to pick them up, and I asked him why he always hit her when he drank the words left my mouth without fear or calculation, and for a moment the house froze. Then his face twisted with a kind of rage that made the air shake as he called me ungrateful and accused me of disrespecting him. And before I could reply, Ashley stepped in with that practiced sigh she used whenever she wanted to look more adult than she was telling me, "You do not air dirty laundry, and you are betraying your family." Both of them staring at me as if truth were a crime that only I kept committing. The label stuck faster than I expected. And the more I tried to defend my mother, the more I became the one who caused trouble, the one who brought shame, and Ashley leaned into that role with precision. Every time Dad drank too much, she would whisper that I provoked him or that I upset the peace, a strange word to use in a house that never felt peaceful. Yet she spoke it with such conviction that by the time I turned 13, most relatives believed I was the defiant one, while Ashley was the daughter holding the family together. One night, everything escalated beyond our usual script when a neighbor called the police because she heard something crash inside our house. I still remember the red and blue lights bleeding through the curtains, while my heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear my mother's soft breathing as she tried to calm me down, and when the two officers knocked on the door, Ashley reached it first, brushing her hair back and smiling faintly as if nothing in the world were wrong, telling them we are fine and Mara is just dramatic, and the officers hesitated because something in the room felt off the sideways chair, the dent in the wall, the way my mother did not quite meet their eyes. But Ashley kept speaking with polished confidence until the officers finally left with a warning to call again if needed. After they drove away, my father turned toward me with an expression that made my stomach drop, a quiet and dangerous anger, telling me if I ever bring outsiders into our business again, I will be out of this house. And I knew he meant it, because in his world, the worst sin was letting anyone see the truth, a truth that made him small, a truth he refused to confront. From that night on, the label became permanent. The child who would call the cops, the child who could not keep quiet, the child who threatened the fragile balance that let my mother keep pretending we were a normal family, and Ashley made sure everyone understood that whatever went wrong could be traced back to my disloyalty. I walked through the house carrying that weight, keeping my questions to myself, feeling the air thicken each time Dad grabbed another bottle, and each time Ashley exchanged a knowing look with him, reminding him that she was on his side, that she would keep the family reputation clean, even if it meant sacrificing me. Sometimes I thought my mother would step in, but years of holding everyone together had worn her down until she barely had the strength to cook dinner without trembling. And though she loved us, she feared conflict more than any injury she had treated in the Navy, because conflict in this house came with consequences she could not control. Still, she saw me more clearly than anyone else. And one night after the police incident, she stepped outside with me onto the back porch, the cool air soft against my face, and she closed the screen door before whispering that I did the right thing. But this family will punish you for it. And her voice carried a sadness that felt heavier than the bruises she tried to hide. It was the first time someone acknowledged that what I felt was real, that the chaos was not my fault, and yet her warning told me everything I needed to know, that in our version of family loyalty, telling the truth meant betrayal, that survival meant silence, that calling violence by its name meant risking everything. I watched the shadows move across the yard as she spoke, and something in me shifted, a quiet recognition that the house was built not on love, but on fear, and appearances that Ashley and Dad would protect the story of our family before they ever protected the people inside it, and that I had already been cast as the one who could not be trusted. Years later, when people in town repeated Ashley lines about me running from hard things, they did not understand that my reputation as the betrayer began long before I left it, began the night I dared to say what everyone else refused to. And in that moment on the porch, listening to my mother whisper the truth in the dark, I understood that in this toxic family, the cost of honesty was isolation, and I carried that understanding with me into every conflict justice moment that followed, even into the hallway where Ashley called me coward all those years later, because in her eyes I had betrayed the family long before I ever put on a uniform. I was 18 the year everything finally broke open, the year I realized the Keaton house was not going to change, no matter how many nights I tried to keep the peace, or how many mornings I woke, hoping my father would drink less, or shout less, or simply look at my mother without that cold, simmering anger that lived under his skin. And by 2015, the pressure inside those walls felt like standing in a room where someone kept slowly turning down the oxygen until breathing itself became an act of defiance. The night that pushed me past the point of pretending began the same way as so many others, with the sound of something falling in the kitchen, followed by my mother's voice tight with fear. And when I ran in, I saw my father with one hand gripping the edge of the counter while the other closed hard around her throat. Her feet barely touching the floor as she tried to pry his fingers loose, and the sight sent a shock through my chest, so strong I could hardly think. Yet Ashley stepped between me and them with that practiced urgency she used whenever she wanted to control the story before anyone else could speak. She pushed at my shoulder, telling me not to escalate her tone, sharp and accusing, as she snapped that I had provoked him earlier by challenging him about money and chores and everything else. She claimed I always stirred up, and while she was talking, he let go of our mother and stumbled back, breathing heavily, muttering that he would not be disrespected in his own house. My mother slid down the cabinet, coughing, and I knelt beside her while Ashley turned to Dad, smoothing her voice, reassuring him that everything was fine, that I had overreacted again, that she would take care of it, and somehow that became the narrative in less than a minute, that I was the problem and he was the wounded one. Something inside me snapped, then not loud or dramatic, but quiet and final. A soft click of realization that staying meant slowly dying piece by piece. So I stood up and said the words nobody expected to hear, my voice steadier than I felt telling them, I am leaving and I am joining the Marines. The room froze. My father stared at me with shock, quickly turning into amusement as he let out a sharp laugh, asking me if I really thought I could survive Marine training, telling me I would quit in the first week, that I was too soft and too fragile and too dramatic to handle real discipline. And Ashley stepped closer, her face red with fury as she shouted that I was abandoning Mom, that I was a coward who ran from real problems, that courage meant staying and fixing things, not running off to play soldier. The word coward echoed in the air like a brand pressed into my skin, and her voice rose louder as she launched into a rant about how selfish I was, how ungrateful, how she had been the one picking up the pieces while I caused chaos, and within an hour she was calling every relative she could reach, spinning a story that made me sound like an impulsive teenager fleeing responsibility because I could not handle dad temper. By the next morning, I was already the subject of small-town whispers, the daughter who ran away, the girl too weak to face family issues, the selfish one who left her mother with all the burden. And even at 18, I understood how quickly Ashley could shape a narrative because she had been doing it all her life. Yet through all of this noise, my mother stayed strangely quiet, bruises already forming along her jaw as she moved through the house gathering her things for work, and I wondered if she would tell me I should reconsider or at least ask me to stay until things settled. But she did none of that. Instead, she entered my room while I was packing the little I owned and closed the door behind her, before sitting beside me on the bed with a heaviness that felt both defeated and determined. She reached into her purse and pulled out an old pair of dog tags, worn and dented the ones she used to keep in a small box with her ribbons, and placed them in my hand along with a plain white envelope containing a few folded bills, telling me in a hushed voice that leaving was not cowardice, that sometimes it was the bravest act a person could choose, that she had once left home at 19 to save her own life and never regretted it. Hearing her say those words made my throat tighten because it was the first time she had openly contradicted Ashley's version of courage, the first time she acknowledged that staying had not been noble for her, but necessary, that she wanted something different for me, even if she did not have the strength to break free herself. And I felt a strange mix of love and sorrow as she told me that the world outside our house could offer me a kind of freedom I had never known, When the morning bus pulled into the station on the edge of town, I climbed aboard without looking back. At first, my backpack heavy with the bare essentials and my mother dog tags tucked inside my pocket. But as the bus started to move, I turned toward the window and saw Ashley standing on the curb with one arm wrapped around our mother's shoulders, pointing directly at me with that same triumphant smirk she wore whenever she won the narrative, her mouth forming the word coward, though the glass muted her voice. My mother did not say anything. She simply watched me with a complicated expression that held pride and fear and regret all tangled together, and I lifted the dog tag slightly in my hand, hoping she would understand that I carried her strength with me. As the town blurred into trees and the highway stretched ahead, I felt a conviction settle deep inside my chest, a quiet vow that one day I would return wearing a uniform. None of them could dismiss a uniform that would shatter every lie Ashley told, and every doubt my father threw at me, because leaving was not running away, it was running toward the life they never imagined I could build. Training at Quantico stripped everything I thought I knew about myself and rebuilt it piece by piece, until the girl who had boarded that bus at 18 was nothing more than a shadow behind the woman who ran the obstacle course at dawn and memorized map grids at midnight. And by the time I finished OCS and moved into the basic school, I felt a new steadiness settling in my bones, a steadiness that did not come from anyone's approval or from trying to appease a toxic family, but from the quiet certainty that I was finally walking a path that belonged to me. I chose the intelligence track because I had always seen patterns where others saw noise, and during training, the instructors noticed how quickly I could read terrain analysis and anticipate enemy movement. So when the selection came for a small targeting unit working alongside fire support teams for high-risk operations in the Middle East, I was chosen younger than most sent overseas at 22, with a stack of manuals, a fresh commission, and a determination to prove that running toward a new life had not been an act of cowardice, but of survival. The first months downrange were a blur of sand and radio chatter and long hours staring at UAV feeds until my eyes burned. Yet something inside me thrived on the pressure, the need to get it right. The knowledge that every dot on the screen was a Marine whose family waited back home, and when the convoy incident happened, it carved my place into the Corps with a force I never expected. We were monitoring a routine route when I spotted an odd pattern in the shadow angles and dust movement along a narrow bend. Nothing dramatic on its own, but off enough to raise every instinct I had trained. So I called for a route shift, pushed hard for confirmation, and argued until my commanding officer trusted my analysis, even though it meant delaying the schedule. And 20 minutes later, an explosion tore through the road exactly where the convoy would have been. 8 Marines went home alive because of a decision made in a dim operations tent by a 23-year-old officer who had once been called too dramatic to handle real life. The unit gave me the call sign Valkyrie after that, partly as a joke about my intensity, and partly because they said I had pulled their brothers away from death. And although I laughed with them, the name settled deeper than they knew, reminding me of the nights I used to lie awake listening for my father's footsteps and wondering if anyone would ever come for us. The legend of Valkyrie grew faster than I was ready for, spreading from our unit to neighboring teams, then into the wider community as commanders circulated the incident report, and suddenly I found myself being asked to brief operations, to teach pattern recognition, to mentor younger Marines who looked at me the way I once looked at the women who had survived more than anyone expected. By 26, I stood on a small stage inside a forward operating base, receiving the Bronze Star with Valor for a series of decisions that protected entire teams during a high-intensity month of operations. And then came the moment the Commandant announced I would also receive the Navy Cross, one of the rarest recognitions given to an officer my age. And while part of me felt pride, another part felt a quiet ache, because as the applause echoed in the room, I knew my family had no idea who I had become. I tried to tell them I really did, sending an email to Ashley first because she always read messages faster than Mom typing out the news about the Bronze Star and the recommendation for the Navy Cross, and her reply arrived 3 hours later consisting of a single line saying "good for you," followed by a reminder that Mom had fallen last week and that Ashley had handled everything, because some of us fight real battles at home, and the coldness of it hit harder than any training blow. I called home twice then, 3 times, each one going to voicemail, until finally my mother picked up sounding rushed and apologetic, telling me Ashley thought it was better not to bother me with domestic issues. And in that moment, I realized nothing had changed, that they still viewed my life as an escape rather than a battleground of its own, that they had never asked what it cost me to serve. When a reporter from Military Times asked if I wanted to dedicate the recognition to anyone, I paused longer than he expected, thinking of the empty bike chain on the fence outside our house, of the sound of my mother's voice when she used to patch up my scraped knees, of Ashley pointing at me through the bus window, calling me coward. And instead of forcing a sentimental answer, I said I wanted to dedicate it to single women who walk away from family drama and toxic family expectations, not to please anyone but to survive. And the quote went viral across military social media, where it resonated with thousands of people who knew exactly what it meant to leave a home that did not love them. Nobody in my family read it, at least not then. And when the invitation came for the formal ceremony, I sent it home out of habit, even though I already knew they would not come, telling myself it would be different this time. But receiving only a short message from Ashley saying she was busy with mom appointments and could not travel, and that I should enjoy my event. On the day of the ceremony, the room filled quickly with Marines in dress uniforms, commanders in front row seats, junior enlisted whispering excitedly about finally seeing Valkyrie in person. And I stood backstage adjusting my cover while listening to chairs scrape and conversations hum. When I peeked into the audience, the section labeled "Family Seating" sat completely empty, its row of chairs perfectly straight and untouched, as if waiting for ghosts rather than people. Major Rhodes, who had been following my career since the convoy incident, approached with a clipboard and nodded toward the empty row, asking no family captain, and something inside me tightened, not with shame, but with a clear, steady acceptance that the people who mattered were already here. I smiled and told him, "Sir, the family that knows this part of me is already in this room." And as he nodded with understanding, I felt for the first time in my life that I truly belonged somewhere. When Dad died in the spring of 2021, the news reached me while I was still overseas, arriving through a short message from Ashley that said nothing more than "he is gone," followed by a line insisting she had handled every detail of the funeral. So I did not need to worry, since I was too busy playing war, and although I had expected his drinking to catch up with him eventually, the finality of it struck me in a strange, quiet way. Not with grief exactly, but with the awareness that another chapter of our family history had closed without anyone asking how it had shaped the people we became. By the time I returned on a short leave, the funeral had already been held, and Ashley met me at the kitchen table with stacks of receipts and printed emails telling me in a clipped, proud tone that she had paid for everything and that the service had been dignified despite my absence, then reminding me that she had told relatives not to expect me, because my military duties always came first. Her voice dipping just enough to communicate judgment, masked as martyrdom. After Dad burial, Ashley moved with astonishing speed, almost as if she had prepared for this moment long before, gathering forms and folders and placing them in front of Mom with a rehearsed sweetness, explaining that it was easier to manage things together if their names were on the same accounts, and Mom, exhausted from grief and years of carrying the emotional weight of that house, signed whatever Ashley placed in front of her, because she had been conditioned to trust the child who stayed the one who claimed to handle real life while I served somewhere far away. It was during that same visit that I noticed the first cracks in the story she had built, small inconsistencies that might have slipped past someone less attuned to patterns. But I had spent years analyzing data for signs of trouble, and the habit carried into every corner of my life. I was looking for coffee filters in the drawer by the fridge when I saw an envelope from the bank half opened, and when I glanced inside, I caught several withdrawals that did not match Mom Habits charges from clothing stores Ashley favored and a credit card payment clearly linked to her name but drawn from Mom account. I asked lightly about it, not in confrontation, but in curiosity. Yet Ashley instantly bristled, her shoulders rising and her eyes narrowing as she snapped that I had no right to question her since I was never here, insisting she handled everything for Mom while I ran around in some uniform imagining myself a hero in one of those revenge stories Marines like to tell. And she threw in that this was not a battlefield that I should leave financial matters to people who understood responsibility. I let the moment pass on the surface, but internally something shifted because it was suddenly clear how deeply she had woven herself into Mom, finances treating her not as a person, but as a piece of property in the ongoing story, financial drama of a family that never quite learned how to function without control. Later that night, while Mom slept and Ashley sat in the living room scrolling through her phone, I quietly sorted through the mail on the counter and found a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs addressed to Mom, a letter explaining that her healthcare benefits review had been attempted but failed due to an address change, and the address listed was not hers, but Ashley's apartment across town. My pulse tightened because this was beyond helpful daughter behavior. This was a calculated redirection of resources. And when I asked Mom the next morning, she looked confused, saying Ashley had told her the VA required a more stable mailing address, then apologizing as if she had done something wrong by not telling me sooner. The betrayal stung deeper because it was not simply about money. It was about ownership of a vulnerable parent, about shaping a narrative where Ashley remained the indispensable caregiver while quietly draining the benefits meant for Mom well-being, a pattern that echoed the revenge, inheritance drama family stories I had heard from other Marines who returned home only to find relatives using grief as leverage. Instead of confronting her outright, I chose a different tactic, a quieter form of resistance. A mini revenge she would not notice until long after the pieces were no longer in her hands. And during one of Mom appointments, I photographed the case number printed on the VA paperwork along with the patient identification code and the previous appointment log. When I returned to base, I scheduled a meeting with a Veterans Service officer and explained the situation carefully, providing Mom updated information and her private email, the one Ashley did not have access to. And with a few signatures, the officer helped establish Mom as the sole point of contact, reactivating her benefits and rerouting all notices directly to her and to me as her military next of kin. It was a quiet shift, barely noticeable from the outside, but from that week forward, every VA email and healthcare reminder bypassed Ashley, entirely returning control to the person who actually needed it, while leaving Ashley to wonder why the flow of information had slowed. I did not tell her, not because I wanted to keep secrets for the sake of pride, but because I understood that confronting her then would only fuel the conflict, justice battle she had prepared for her entire life. And I knew timing mattered more than immediate satisfaction. Over the next few days, I observed more signs of what she had been doing. Small red flags like the way she rushed to intercept the mail before Mom could see it, or how she redirected questions about bills, and even though I felt anger rising in my chest, I pushed it down, reminding myself that everything had to unfold gradually, so the betrayal family karma she had set in motion would eventually circle back without me having to force it. On the last night of that leave, I stood in the guest room staring at the old dresser drawer where I had once kept school notebooks and thought about the distance between the legend of Valkyrie that existed in the Marine Corps and the version of me my sister still tried to shape, the girl she insisted was selfish and absent and disconnected from real life. And it struck me how she clung to that image because it justified her control, her narrative, her claim that I had forfeited the right to question her choices. As I packed for my flight back to base, I realized Ashley toxicity had grown roots far deeper than I understood when I first left this house. She was not simply cruel or manipulative. She had learned to treat mom life as an extension of her own, a financial and emotional resource she could tap into whenever she needed validation or stability. That night, as I walked through the quiet hallway, I told myself there would be a time to expose the truth, a time to pull every thread until the whole structure she had built unraveled in front of her. But that moment was not yet, and the patience felt strange coming from someone trained to make rapid decisions under pressure. Yet I trusted the instinct that told me to wait. By the time my leave ended and I boarded the plane back to base, I had accepted something I had resisted for years. The understanding that Ashley was not just the toxic emotional force of my childhood, but now a key player in a storied financial web that would eventually demand consequences. The betrayal and exploitation layered enough that it would collapse under its own weight, and I promised myself I would be ready when that collapse finally came. The breaking point came slowly at first, almost like a small tremor beneath my feet that I tried to ignore, and it began during a night exercise on base when the air was thick with humidity and the range lights flickered against the dark sky, while my team moved through a live fire drill meant to simulate disorientation under stress, and I remember feeling the usual pressure to track every pattern in the radio traffic, because it was my responsibility to keep the information straight. Yet something slipped in the relay, a tiny distortion between two channels, and before I could correct it, a young Marine named Barrett advanced too far into the hot zone, and a round ricocheted near him, sending shrapnel into his shoulder so suddenly that the entire line froze. I rushed toward him along with the corpsman, and as they carried him out, I felt that familiar bite of guilt tightening through my ribs, the same guilt that used to hit me in childhood when I tried to shield Mom from Dad and failed. And as I stared at the blood on my gloves, I kept thinking, if I had caught that pattern sooner, he would not be lying there, in pain. Breathing fast, trying to reassure me that he was fine, even though I saw the fear behind his eyes. Hours later, after he was stabilized in the medical bay, I walked outside into the humid night, my uniform sticking to my back, my heart heavy with the memory of every Marine I had ever guided through dangerous terrain, everyone I had saved, and everyone I almost lost, and that was when my phone buzzed with a FaceTime call from Ashley. I should have let it go to voicemail, but I answered, still shaken, my eyes red and my voice barely steady, and Ashley's face filled the screen with the harsh light of her living room lamp. Her expression already primed for accusation as she said Mom fell again, and she had to take her to the emergency room while I was off somewhere playing Valkyrie, as if the name were some childish fantasy, rather than a call sign earned through years of real decisions with real consequences. I tried to explain that I just came from the medical bay, that I had nearly lost a Marine, but before I could get the words out, she cut me off with a cold laugh, telling me I always left her to clean the mess Dad made, that I never stayed long enough to face anything hard, that I was the same scared kid who hid in the hallway at 16, except now I wore a uniform with ribbons to pretend I had grown up. She leaned closer to the camera and said it slowly to make sure it stuck, calling me a coward with medals. And something inside me crumpled because the timing of that word collided with the echo of guilt already pulsing through my chest. I said nothing, unable to trust my voice, and when she ended the call, the screen went black and reflected my face back at me, tired and hollow, and I realized how deeply her words had been carved into me over the years. How easily she reached the part of me that still believed I needed to earn worthiness by proving I was not what she said. The next morning, before I even had coffee, my phone buzzed again, this time with notifications from Facebook, because Ashley had posted a picture of Mom in a hospital bed, smiling weakly with a caption that said, "Some of us stay and care for our parents, while others only show up in photos with ribbons." And she tagged me so the entire town could see, and the comments poured in from neighbors who once watched us play in sprinklers, people who never knew what went on inside that house, telling Ashley she was such a good daughter, praising her devotion while I stood alone in my barracks room, scrolling through the thread with a tight jaw and a hot mix of anger and helplessness swirling in my chest. I wanted to defend myself, but I knew posting the truth would drag Mom trauma into the open in a way she never asked for. So I swallowed it, the humiliation sinking deeper, turning into the kind of revenge emotional pressure that made my hands tremble as I shut off my phone. I spent the rest of the day functioning on autopilot, attending briefings, reviewing after action reports, pushing through tasks with a mechanical calm. But by evening, the weight of it all finally collapsed around me, and I sat alone in an empty conference room, staring at the wall until the door opened and Major Rhodes stepped inside. He did not ask about the exercise or the mishap or Barrett injury. He simply looked at me quietly, then asked, "When was the last time I let someone outside my family define my worth?" A question so unexpected that I felt something in my chest loosen, because it forced me to confront how much power I still allowed Ashley to have. How every time she used that word coward, I let it land as if it came from someone who had actually stood with me on the battlefield or watched me carry a wounded Marine to safety. I realized in that moment that no one who had ever served with me had questioned my courage. No one who had been under fire with me had ever doubted my judgment or my backbone, and the only people who still clung to that word were the same ones who once told me to stay silent when Dad raged through the house, the same ones who shaped a toxic family narrative that punished anyone who dared tell the truth. The room stayed quiet as Rhodes waited for me to answer, and I finally breathed out slowly, acknowledging that the label coward had never belonged to me. It had been placed on me by people afraid of what my leaving revealed about the life they stayed in. That realization did not erase the hurt, but it shifted something inside me, something steady and resolute, and as I walked back to my barracks that night, I felt a spark of clarity that would eventually lead me to the Veterans Day moment, the moment when their word coward would finally collide with the truth. The Marines already knew the truth, that nothing in my life had ever been shaped by fear, only by the determination to step out of a home that tried to break me and into a world where courage meant leading people through danger, not surviving someone else's anger. Veterans Day arrived with the kind of cold morning air that made every sound sharper, and as I drove toward Jacksonville Town Hall, the sky was pale enough to feel like the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for a ceremony that meant one thing to my mother and something entirely different to my sister. And I sat in the parking lot for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, reminding myself that this was her day, not mine, even though Ashley had spent the past week making sure I understood how unwelcome I was. Inside the lobby bustled with volunteers carrying folding chairs and high school band students tuning their instruments, while the scent of coffee and old wood drifted through the hall, and I spotted Ashley near the stage directing people with the confidence of someone who believed the event belonged to her. She saw me approach and forced a smile for the crowd, then seized my arm hard enough that her nails dug through my sleeve, whispering through her teeth that I was not to make this into a military spectacle about myself, and that I should stay in the back where I would not confuse anyone about who actually cared for Mom. I told her calmly that I was simply here to support our mother, but she tightened her grip and hissed that I should not pretend to be noble, because I had abandoned them years ago. And as she dragged me toward the side hallway where families waited, she leaned in and said the word coward softly but sharply, just like the day in the hook, and before I could step away, she added, "If you had stayed, maybe Dad would not have died so broken, and maybe Mom would not be so fragile," each word slicing deeper than the last, because she knew exactly where to strike. I swallowed the sting, deciding to stay quiet to keep the peace, and I stepped back, intending to slip into a far row where no one would notice me, determined not to let her push me out of the ceremony completely. But then the double doors opened, and the sound of polished shoes on tile filled the hall as a group of Marines in dress blues entered with the kind of presence that commanded attention instantly, and I recognized Gunnery Sergeant Ortiz leading them in with his usual steady stride, followed by Lieutenant Colonel Rhodes, whose sharp gaze scanned the room until it landed on me, his expression shifting from surprise to respect so subtly that only someone who had served with him would notice. Their presence alone would have drawn whispers, but what happened next turned the entire atmosphere on its axis, because standing behind them was a retired Marine Master Sergeant I had only met once during the awards cycle, a man whose interview quote in the Military Times piece had added weight to the story about the convoy and the second operation against the cartel, aligned militia. And he stopped abruptly when he saw me tap the man next to him and whispered, "That is her. That is the Valkyrie from that cartel raid story, the one who rerouted the drone feed and saved that team in the canyon." And he said it with enough awe that the two locals beside him turned their heads and stared at me as if I had transformed in front of them. The ripple spread before anyone could stop it. The realization that the quiet woman Ashley had called coward moments earlier was the same woman some Marines only whispered about in training circles, and the contradiction between who I was to them and who I had been painted to be in this town created a tension that tightened the air like a storm waiting to break. Ashley noticed the shift and glanced around with growing unease, her eyes narrowing when she saw Ortiz standing at attention near me, his voice crisp as he greeted me quietly with Captain Keaton. "Mom, we did not expect you today," and the words hung in the air long enough for the nearest row to hear, including a woman I recognized from church, who blinked as if trying to reconcile two versions of me she had never imagined could be the same person. Before Ashley could regain control of the narrative, the Master of Ceremonies tapped the microphone to call everyone to their seats, but Rhodes stepped forward and requested a moment, his voice calm but authoritative, in a way that made people instinctively listen, and he said, "Before we honor Corpsman Linda Keaton, we would be wrong not to acknowledge another warrior whose service has touched Marines far beyond this town." I felt my pulse thrum as every head in the hall turned, and I realized what was about to happen, the moment that would shatter every story Ashley had crafted for years, the moment where truth rose quietly but unmistakably. Rhodes lifted his chin and said, "Captain Mara Keaton, United States Marine Corps, call sign Valkyrie, please stand." And the room froze as I stepped forward, every step steady. Even though inside I felt the swirl of revenge, emotional tension, and conflict justice rising through me, not the ugly desire to humiliate someone, but the deeper need to reclaim the truth I had buried for so long. I saw Ashley in the front row, her grip tightening around the program in her hands until the paper bent, and beside her, my mother stood slowly turning toward me with an expression that carried pride, disbelief, and something tender I had not seen since childhood. As I approached the front, I kept my breathing controlled, reminding myself not to let the surge of emotion turn this into a spectacle, because this was not about revenge in the loud, dramatic sense. This was about letting the truth speak for itself. Rhodes continued once I stood near the podium, and in a voice that resonated through the hall, he said the same Mara Keaton who left this town at 18 is the officer who brought 8 Marines home alive last year, and some people call that cowardice, while we call it courage. And the room erupted in a wave of murmurs as the narrative Ashley had guarded so fiercely unraveled in front of neighbors, church members, veterans, and friends who had shaped their opinions of me through her stories. I felt the shift like a physical release, a loosening of the chain she had kept around my identity for years, and though I did not look directly at her, I could feel the humiliation settling over her as heavily as the pride rising quietly in my mother's eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the ground beneath me steady in a way that had nothing to do with the course and everything to do with finally being seen for who I was. When Rhodes finished speaking and the applause softened into a steady hum that pulsed through the hall, the Master of Ceremonies cleared his throat and announced that a family member would now share a few words about my mother, and immediately Ashley rose from her seat with the stiff pride of someone who believed the narrative was still hers to command. She stepped toward the podium, clutching her speech notes, and as she passed me, her eyes flicked with a sharp warning as if to say, "Do not you dare interrupt me." Then she turned to the microphone with her best public smile and began weaving the same story she had spent years repeating, telling everyone that Mom was the anchor of the family and that some people stayed through storms while others ran from them, letting her voice glide smoothly over the implication that I had left them behind in their time of need. I stood just behind her to the right, my posture relaxed and my breathing steady, watching the crowd absorb her words, while the Marines in the front row exchanged quiet glances that revealed exactly what they thought of this carefully crafted version of our past, and I waited, letting Ashley settle into the rhythm of her story, because I knew the right moment would come. When she paused to breathe between sentences, I leaned slightly forward and asked in a calm voice that carried just enough to be heard through the hall if I could add something, since I am the coward in the story, and the room let out a soft collective exhale, a sound that was not laughter, but something warmer, a recognition that I had just punctured a balloon Ashley had spent years inflating. Her shoulders stiffened, her grip tightening on the edge of the podium as she turned toward me in disbelief, and for the first time I saw her lose the control she guarded so fiercely. I stepped beside her, not pushing her away but simply taking my place at the mic, and the hall grew quiet in that anticipatory way. People fall silent at funerals or graduations, waiting to witness the moment that shifts everything. I spoke slowly, letting each word settle, without anger or theatrics, telling them that in our home growing up, there were nights when the walls shook with violence, and days when silence was the only language anyone understood. And I explained that our mother, who once treated wounded Marines overseas, hid her own wounds at home because she believed that protecting a family image was safer than exposing the truth to outsiders. I did not describe Dad in detail or recount every bruise or broken plate. I simply said, "Mom taught me through her Navy stories that you do not stay in a burning ship to prove a point. You get people out, and that leaving that house was not running from a fight. It was running toward a different fight, one where my bruises were not the entry fee for belonging." A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably, the kind of movement that comes when denial cracks and light slips through, and I could feel Ashley staring at me in shock, realizing too late that I had spoken without once mentioning her name. Yet everyone understood exactly who had stayed silent all those years and why. It was a small but potent mini revenge, the kind that does not need volume or cruelty, the kind that reveals truth with a single steady sentence. And I watched as the expressions of the townspeople began to change their sympathy, sliding away from Ashley's carefully manicured narrative and settling into something more complicated, something closer to truth. The pastor from Mom Church folded his hands in front of him, nodding slowly, as if he had finally aligned the stories he heard over the years with the gaps that never quite made sense, and a group of elder veterans in the second row leaned forward with the quiet recognition of men who had seen their own families fracture under the weight of silence. I stepped back from the microphone, leaving the air charged but calm, refusing to let the moment turn into revenge drama, because I knew the truth itself was more powerful than anything I could force. Ashley tried to recover, clearing her throat and attempting to retake the mic, yet her voice trembled slightly, and the confident rhythm she always used in public speeches slipped out of reach. And as she stumbled through the rest of her notes, the audience attention stayed fixed elsewhere, their eyes following me, as if finally seeing the thread of family betrayal woven through the years. When the ceremony ended and people rose from their seats, families pulling jackets on and adjusting scarves, a small line formed near my mother and me neighbors, offering hesitant smiles, veterans giving short respectful nods, and Ashley hovering nearby as if trying to pull the spotlight back, but finding no one looking in her direction. As the crowd thinned, a frail elderly woman with silver hair tucked neatly behind her ears approached slowly, using a cane, her steps measured but purposeful. and she reached for my hand with a grip surprisingly firm for someone her size. She leaned close, her voice soft but unwavering as she said, "My daughter walked out on her toxic father too, and people called her selfish, but leaving saved her life, and she is the bravest person I know." And in that moment, I felt a cord inside me loosen, something deep and tightly wound, finally easing because she had named the truth without needing details, carrying the weight of her own story as she recognized mine. I thanked her quietly, my throat tightening, and she squeezed my fingers before walking away with a dignity that felt like a benediction. Watching her disappear into the dispersing crowd, I understood that something had shifted far beyond Ashley discomfort. Something in the collective understanding of this town, and even though Ashley would not grasp the full consequences yet, the foundation of her narrative had cracked in front of everyone, and there was no patching it back together. The fallout began quietly, almost gently, like the first shift of wind before a storm, and it started the same evening as the ceremony when someone uploaded a clip of Rhodes' introduction and my brief speech to Facebook, then to a local veterans group, then to YouTube, and within 24 hours the video had spread across Jacksonville faster than any story Ashley had ever told about me. Comments poured in beneath the clip lines of text flashing across my phone as I lay in my small base apartment trying to unwind people writing. I did not know Mara was Valkyrie, and I always thought Ashley said she ran away, but it looks like she ran straight into the Marines, and suddenly the narrative Ashley had controlled for a decade began to slip through her fingers like water she could not catch. The next Sunday at church, the pastor approached Mom and me together, inviting us to a lunch hosted by the Women Veterans Support Group, and he spoke to me with a respect that made Ashley stiffen where she stood across the room clutching her bulletin. Because in that moment she realized the attention she once monopolized was shifting in a direction she could not redirect or spin. And in the following week, the Veterans Association asked if I would speak at their monthly gathering about emotional resilience after deployments and surviving family betrayal, topics that struck at the heart of older veterans and their spouses, many of whom carried their own versions of toxic family scars. For years, Ashley had been the public face of the Keaton family in town, settings presenting herself as the daughter who stayed the one who sacrificed. Yet now invitations that once went exclusively to her began arriving with my name on them, addressed to Captain Mara Keaton, and each one chipped a little more at the pedestal she spent so long building. One afternoon after the ceremony, while I sat with the pastor and a small committee reviewing plans for a community caregiving initiative, I suggested a simple but transformative change, recommending that funds for caregiving support go directly to certified caregivers, rather than through relatives who acted as gatekeepers, explaining softly that too many families placed unspoken burdens on daughters or siblings without offering them real help, and the pastor nodded thoughtfully, while the committee agreed without hesitation, and within a month the church implemented the system for everyone, not just us. Mom soon hired a part-time caregiver named Carla, a warm woman with a calm voice who helped her with appointments and errands twice a week. And each hour Carla spent with Mom was an hour Ashley no longer controlled because she could no longer claim that Mom depended entirely on her, a shift so subtle that Ashley did not recognize it as a form of silent revenge, yet its impact cut straight through the soft power she had guarded for years. I noticed the tension building in Ashley each time she arrived at Mom House and found Carla already helping with groceries or organizing medication. And although she hid her discomfort behind a strained smile, I could tell she felt something slipping, something she could not name because the dynamic where she decided who had access to Mom was beginning to crumble. But the deeper unraveling came when I suggested to Mom that we meet with a lawyer and a veteran service officer, not with the intention of punishing Ashley, but to protect Mom financial stability, because Dad passing had left debts and tangled paperwork that Ashley had handled alone in ways that never felt entirely transparent. We met at a small law office downtown, the walls lined with certificates and a framed Marine Corps flag, and the lawyer reviewed the property documents and bank statements, frowning slightly as he noticed irregular withdrawals tied to Ashley credit card payments and a change of address filed with VA mail that Mom had not approved. The Veteran Service Officer helped us reroute Mom VA benefits to a private account under her name, with a secondary supervisory access for me not to control her, but to ensure Ashley could no longer move money unseen. And together we transferred the house into a living trust managed by a neutral trustee, so no one child could make unilateral decisions about its future. It was a clean, practical step, a form of story financial defense that protected Mom and restored her dignity. And although Ashley had no idea it was happening at the time, the shock hit her a week later at a grocery store checkout when the card she had been using for years was declined twice in a row. She messaged me immediately in a flurry of panic asking if something was wrong with Mom finances because the card was not working, and I replied evenly that the accounts had been updated to make sure Mom money was used for her needs first, which was true, and nothing more. And while the explanation was gentle, the implication was unmistakable, because for the first time in her adult life, Ashley could not reach into Mom's wallet whenever she wanted. That small moment of panic was another layer of silent revenge, though she did not see the full pattern yet, not realizing that the trust and VA account restructuring meant she could no longer access funds without oversight, no longer pull strings behind closed doors, no longer treat Mom resources as her personal safety net. The ripple effects continued through the community as well because people who once believed Ashley's stories about me approached Mom in person to express gratitude for the years she served as a Navy corpsman and curiosity about my service as Valkyrie. And each conversation shifted the social landscape one step further away from the narrative Ashley tried to preserve. Her friends grew noticeably colder, their looks uncertain, as if reassessing everything she had told them. And even though she walked through town with her chin high and her tone clipped, she carried an unease in her eyes that told me she felt the ground tilting beneath her. Meanwhile, I continued supporting Mom, quietly attending church events, visiting the VA office, helping her organize medical documents, and every action was measured not by vengeance, but by the steady determination to rebuild what Ashley had undermined for years, each step aligning with the revenge inheritance drama family undercurrent that formed the spine of our new reality. Through all this, I kept my voice steady and my presence calm, because the most powerful revenge I could deliver was not loud or dramatic, but quietly reshaping the systems Ashley once controlled, ensuring that Mom's safety and dignity were no longer dependent on someone who saw her as leverage rather than as a person deserving of genuine care. The unraveling of Ashley control did not explode all at once. It collapsed in slow, jagged sections, like an old porch, giving way under years of hidden rot. And the first real crack appeared when the bank called Mom to verify several credit accounts Ashley had opened using her name accounts that had slipped through unnoticed until the trust restructuring forced a routine audit that Ashley had never anticipated. And when the bank froze the cards pending investigation, she panicked because for the first time she had to face numbers she could not manipulate and bills she could not hide behind Mom's gentle signature. Her husband, hours at work, had been cut back months earlier, something she never told us, and she had relied heavily on the money she funneled from Mom accounts to patch the holes. But once those accounts were secured and the trust locked down, she found herself drowning in debt that she could no longer disguise as caregiving expenses, and the bank demanded proof of income she did not have, telling her explicitly that she could not use her mother benefits to pay off her personal credit lines. For nearly a week, she spiraled, avoiding calls from Mom and posting vague messages online about stress and betrayal, until one humid afternoon, she appeared at the small rental house I kept near base, pounding on my door with a desperation that carried through the wood. When I opened it, she pushed past me into the living room, her hair disheveled and her breathing uneven, and she looked around the small space with disbelief, as if she expected a high-ranking officer to be living in some polished quarters, rather than a modest one-bedroom with bare walls and a single bookshelf. She turned toward me, eyes sharp with frustration, and said, "You have rank and you know officers and you are Valkyrie, for God's sake. So you can fix this. You can get my husband a job on base or talk to someone at the bank or something." And her voice cracked into a plea she tried to disguise as anger, insisting that I owed her because she stayed home and cared for Mom while I was out winning medals. I let her finish standing still, letting the storm move through the room without reacting. And when she finally went quiet, I spoke softly, telling her I would always help Mom, but I would not help her use Mom again. Telling her that I was not her bailout, and that this was not revenge, but simply her choices meeting their own consequences, words that made her flinch as if I had struck her because she had expected me to bend under the old weight of guilt she used to place on my shoulders. She accused me of silent revenge, then of punishing her for years of misunderstanding, and she called me cold and heartless, claiming that military life had drained compassion out of me, demanding to know why I would not save her when I had saved so many strangers overseas. And for a moment I saw the child she once was the one who learned early to survive by aligning with the strongest person in the house. And I understood that she had never learned how to function without someone else shielding her from consequences. As she continued arguing, her voice rising, a group of Marines passed by on their way to the parking lot. Young corporals and sergeants who recognized me instantly and stiffened before nodding with respect, greeting me with a crisp "Mom, Captain." And the shift in Ashley's expression was immediate, her eyes widening as she realized that in this world, I was not the coward she had painted, but someone entirely outside her control. Someone these men trusted to lead them into danger. Someone whose name carried weight she had never imagined. For a long moment she said nothing, her gaze flicking between the Marines retreating down the walkway and the calmness in my posture. And then her mouth tightened as she tried to regain the upper hand, telling me that if I truly loved Mom, I would fix her financial situation, because everything she did was for Mom, not for herself, a lie she had repeated so often that she had almost convinced herself it was true. I met her eyes and answered with the steadiness of someone who had finally learned to protect her boundaries, telling her if you loved Mom, you would not have broken it, a sentence so simple and so undeniably true that it stripped away every layer of justification she had tried to build. She froze, her face paling as the words settled into the spaces she'd refused to look at for years, and then she stepped back, suddenly unsure of her footing, realizing that the version of me she had grown up dominating no longer existed. She left without slamming the door, walking to her car with a stiffness that revealed her panic. And as I watched her drive away, I felt no satisfaction or triumph, only a quiet justice settling through me like steady ground after a long march, the understanding that she was finally beginning to face the cost of her actions without anyone shielding her. I closed my door gently, leaning against it for a moment, feeling the echo of the scene linger in the air, knowing this was not an ending, but a turning point, one where she had to confront the truth she had avoided, and I had finally spoken aloud, and although she called it silent revenge, I knew it was something else entirely, something older and steadier, the natural reckoning that comes when betrayal can no longer hide behind the mask of sacrifice. A full year passed in a rhythm so steady it almost felt like exhaling after holding my breath for an entire decade, and in that time, the shape of our family changed in ways that were small on the surface, but profound in the quiet spaces where real healing takes root, because Mom settled into a life that finally belonged to her, with her VA benefits arriving on time each month, and the house resting safely in a trust managed by someone who cared only about her welfare rather than any one personal agenda. And with the part-time caregiver checking in regularly, she no longer depended on Ashley for every ride or errand, a shift that lightened her shoulders and softened her voice in ways I had not heard since I was a child. My own life shifted too, as I transitioned into a role training younger officers, teaching them to make decisions under pressure without letting fear hollow them out. And I discovered that guiding them through their first leadership challenges felt strangely similar to guiding my younger self out of the shadows of our old home. Because moral courage is something you practice more than something you feel, and the lessons you learn from surviving a toxic family can sometimes echo louder than anything learned on a battlefield. Ashley remained in town, orbiting around the edges of our lives, with a tension that never eased but never erupted occasionally, stopping by Mom House, but without the authority she once held, her presence more cautious now that her access to mom finances had been severed and her reputation subtly reshaped by the social aftermath of the ceremony. And whenever she complained about her debts or her husband's unstable job, no one swooped in to rescue her because the well of sympathy she once relied on had run dry. People still greeted her politely, but with a hint of distance, an unspoken understanding that she had been the architect of her own storm. And every time she faced another bill collector or another closed door, she tasted the quiet bitterness of betrayal. Family karma not as a punishment inflicted by anyone else, but as the natural consequence of seeds she had planted for years. And yet, despite the tension, none of us cut ties completely. Because families are rarely made of clean endings. They are made of uneven lines and careful distance of boundaries that protect without severing. And in that fragile balance, we found a way to coexist, even if forgiveness remained something far out on the horizon. When Veterans Day came around again, the town held a smaller parade on Main Street. Nothing grand, but warm and familiar, with flags tucked into shop windows and children holding tiny paper banners as the marching band warmed up near the corner bakery. And Mom and I arrived early enough to find a spot on a low bench beneath a sycamore tree. The morning light was soft and kind as it filtered through the branches, and for a moment I allowed myself to simply watch her, the way her eyes followed the crowd with a peacefulness she had not known for most of her marriage, her hands resting calmly in her lap, rather than braced for whatever chaos Dad might unleash, and I felt a quiet gratitude settle through me, because protecting her had once felt impossible, yet here she was living freely in a way she had earned many times over. When the parade started, a small group of young Marines marched past, their uniforms crisp and their cadence steady, and one of them glanced toward us and did a double take before leaning toward the Marine beside him and whispering, "Is that Captain Valkyrie?" a question that drifted through the air just loud enough for Mom to hear. She smiled in a way that melted something inside me, a soft, proud smile that reached her eyes as she answered, "Yes, that is my daughter," and she said it with the gentle certainty of someone who finally understood that I had not abandoned her. I had simply walked toward a life where courage had room to breathe. I watched the Marines continue down the street, their boots striking the pavement in a steady rhythm, and somewhere between the drumline and the distant chatter of the crowd, I heard my younger self, the girl who left that house carrying a backpack of fear and hope in equal measure. And for the first time, I did not feel the weight of the word coward lingering inside me. People had called me coward when I walked out of that house, and they had called me Valkyrie when I walked into the fire overseas. But neither label had ever been the truth, because the truth was simpler and quieter. Just someone who finally chose which voices deserved space in her life, and which ones did not. Someone who learned that courage is not always loud and defiant. Sometimes it is a single step away from the place that tried to break you. As the parade wound down and the crowd dispersed, I felt a stillness settle inside me, not triumph or victory, but closure, the kind that comes from standing in your own story without apology. And I knew the journey had not been about proving anything to Ashley or to the town, but about reclaiming the parts of myself that had been buried under years of noise. If you have ever been called selfish or coward simply because you chose yourself over a toxic family, I hope you hear something familiar in this story. And if any part of Mara, quiet justice or silent revenge, spoke to your heart, I would love to know your age and where you are watching from, because these revenge through truth stories are not about hate. They are about emotional resilience and dignity over money, and standing up for yourself and reclaiming respect and finding truth and closure without losing your soul. If you want more lessons in betrayal and more justice without hate, do not forget to subscribe, because there are more stories waiting for someone who needs to hear that courage sometimes begins with walking away.